Chapter 2. In the shop. While the sign about Oliver was on the gate, a man covered with black suit wandered past the workhouse. He pulled a donkey along beside him. The man was a chimney sweep, and he almost troubled about something. In fact, he owed a good deal of money to his landlord and could not think of a way to pay it. The donkey stumbled in front of the workhouse, and the man turned and licked it again and again, muttering curses at it. Suddenly, his eye caught sight of the sign on the gate. He stopped to read it. He grinned and scratched his scrubby face. £5, he whispered to himself. Just then, Mr. Bumble came and asked if he needed a boy to work for him. The man nodded. Then follow me, said Mr. Bumble. Mr. Bumble took him to see the directors of the workhouse. It is very dangerous to clean chimneys, said one of the directors when he heard that the man wanted to take Oliver Twist. Many boys have been caught in them and have smothered to death by smoke. Never mind, said the man in the white vest. It's a good trade for a boy like Oliver Twist. The other men at the table laughed. They told Mr. Bumble to bring Oliver before a judge so that he could be signed over to the chimney sweep. Later in court, Oliver stood before a kindly judge who wore little round glasses on the end of his nose. The judge asked the chimney sweep, "Will you take good care of this boy, sir, and teach him a trade?" The chimney sweep grinned and nodded. Oliver stared in horror at the man's cruel, ugly face. He was terrified to think that he would have to work for him. The judge had a pen ready to sign Oliver's papers, but he couldn't seem to find the ink. As he was looking for it, he chanced to raise his head and saw Oliver in front of him, wide-eyed with fear. "My boy," exclaimed the judge, leaning over his desk. "You look alarmed. What is the matter?" Oliver clasped his hands together and begged the judge to do anything rather than send him away with that dreadful man. He said he would rather go back to the dark room and be beaten than go with him. The judge turned to Mr. Bumble and said, "I refuse to sign this boy over to that man. Take him back to the workhouse and treat him more kindly." Mr. Bumble tried to find someone else to take care of young Oliver, with no luck. One day he happened to meet Mr. Sowerberry, the undertaker, who said, "Hello, Mr. Bumble. I have just measured the woman who died last night at the workhouse. I will finish making her coffin as soon as I can." Much to his surprise, Mr. Bumble soon learned that Mr. Sowerberry wanted Oliver Twist to work in his house and shop. It was all settled in a few hours. Oliver was brought to the coffin maker's door that evening. Mr. Sowerberry's nasty wife took Oliver into the kitchen and gave him some scraps to eat. She showed him a place under the counter in the shop, where he was to sleep. Then she left him. Oliver looked around fearfully. A half-finished coffin lay on the table in the middle of the shop. It was so gloomy in the room that Oliver almost expected to see some frightful creature get out of it and walk towards him. Against the wall was a long row of boards, all cut into the same coffin shape. They looked like a row of square-shouldered ghosts to Oliver. Oliver was awakened in the morning by the sound of someone at the front step. "Open the door, will you?" cried a voice outside. Oliver opened the door and found himself face to face with a big boy who seemed to have very small eyes for such a large head. "You don't know who I am, do you?" the big boy growled at him. "No, sir, I don't," replied Oliver. "I'm Noah Claypole, you little workhouse brat, and I work here. You have to follow my orders. Now get that broom over there and be quick about it." Noah Claypole shouted at Oliver and kicked him when they were alone, but not when the owner of the shop was there. Mr. Sowerberry liked Oliver. He thought the boy had a nice face. He especially liked the look of sadness about him. After Oliver had been there a month, Mr. Sowerberry decided to have him take part in the funerals. He gave Oliver a hat and coat to wear, and Oliver walked with Mr. Sowerberry on many occasions. This made Noah Claypole very jealous. He tried to hurt Oliver more often than before. Noah made Oliver miserable whenever he could. One day, they were both in the kitchen being fed by Mrs. Sowerberry when she left the room. Noah grabbed Oliver by the hair and pulled on his ear. He was very disappointed that Oliver didn't cry, so Noah decided to make him cry another way. "Hey, brat," Noah said, "how's your mother?" "She's dead," replied Oliver quickly. "Don't you say anything about her to me." Oliver's face turned red when he said this, and he started to blink rapidly. Noah thought he must be about to cry. He laughed and said, "You know, brat, it's not your fault your mother was such a bad one." Oliver was enraged. He leapt up, seized Noah by the throat, and shook him until his teeth chattered in his head. Then, putting all his force into one blow, he knocked Noah to the ground. A moment before, he had been a quiet, mild boy, but the insult to his mother had made him fierce. "Help!" cried Noah. "He's trying to kill me." Mrs. Sowerberry ran back into the kitchen. She was a nasty woman, who always preferred to think badly of other people. When she saw Oliver glaring at Noah and heard Noah's cries, she screamed, "The boy is dangerous. It's a wonder we all haven't been murdered by him already." She tried to take hold of Oliver, but he struggled and fought against her. "Quick, Noah," she replied. "Run and get Mr. Bumble from the workhouse." Noah got up and ran quickly to the gate of the workhouse. Mr. Bumble, he yelled. "Oliver Twist has tried to kill me. Come at once." When they entered the shop, Mr. Sowerberry was there. He listened in astonishment to what his wife had to say about Oliver Twist. "Perhaps he is mad," Mr. Sowerberry said at last. "It's not his madness," said Mr. Bumble sternly. "It's meat." "What?" exclaimed Mrs. Sowerberry. "You've overfed him, madame," said Mr. Bumble. "If you had kept him on gruel such as we fed him at the workhouse, this would not have happened. You've made him headstrong and willful. He has spirit. A poor boy like him does not need spirit. He should always be humble and meek." Now, although Mrs. Sowerberry had given Oliver a few scraps of meat, she had never overfed him. But she smiled and said, "So, this is what comes of my being generous." Oliver was not given a chance to defend himself. Mrs. Sowerberry hit him whenever he tried to speak. Mr. Bumble told the coffin maker to whip the boy soundly, then starve him for a few days. Then he marched off. Mrs. Sowerberry sighed. He would have preferred not to follow Mr. Bumble's orders, but his wife insisted. After Oliver was whipped, he was left in the shop for the night. When he was done, Oliver sat for a long time with his head in his hands. Then he got up and looked out the window. It was a cold, dark night. The stars seemed further away than they ever had before. There was no wind. The shadows that lay on the ground were terribly still and deathlike. Oliver tied up in a handkerchief what few things he had and sat down to wait for the morning. As soon as the first rays of light entered the room, Oliver opened the door and ran away. He never looked back. There was no one to whom he wanted to say goodbye.